My teacher, Rabbi Noach Weinberg, he used to ask us, he would say, if you ask a good man or an evil man, are you a good man? Who is more likely to say he's good? And everybody, when they hear the question, they understand the evil man is more likely to say he's good, to think he's good. Because the reality is that no human gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to do evil.
This is the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish perspective podcast, where we take ambiguous moral situations in fictional popular movies and TV shows and analyze them from a Torah lens. As a quick overview, Don Corleone, or the Godfather, was the head of a mafia family in New York. He oversaw a business founded on gambling, bootlegging, and murder. Even so, he was known as a kind, generous man who lived by a strict moral code of loyalty to friends and, above all, family. He tried to spread these values throughout the New York crime world and disagreed with many of the brutal crimes carried out by gangs. He also disapproved of hard drugs and held himself above prostitution. Don Corleone's reputation for compassion and generosity, especially when compared to his rivals, meant that people were more willing to deal with the Corleones over other mob bosses. The various crime families in the New York area adopted his proposed business model for organized crime because of its effectiveness in securing greater profitability for them. Don Corleone is therefore a bit of a complicated character. On the one hand, he's a criminal, he's engaged in murder, he's involved in gambling, he's involved in bribing and corrupting judges and politicians. He threatened with death the band leader to release his godson, Johnny Fontaine, who was a rising star in the music industry, from his contract with the band leader so Johnny could go independent. However, Corleone also only made the threat after offering $10,000 to do so, which would be worth over $200,000 today. The band leader refused. Then came the threat, and the band leader released Johnny. Corleone still gave the band leader $1,000. Corleone beheaded a prize horse and put the head into the horse owner's bed to get Johnny Fontaine into a movie. On the other hand, he stays out of the drug trade despite its potential for huge profit. He stays out of prostitution. He helps people. He mitigates the severity of crime in his city. He adopted and raised Tom Hagen, an orphan boy. Lastly, Don Corleone had 3 sons. His third son, Michael, didn't want to have anything to do with the gangster life and even drafted himself into the army during World War II to get out. However, when Michael comes back after the war, his father is almost assassinated, and Michael comes in to defend his family, and eventually becomes the head of the family crime syndicate, replacing his father while his father was still alive. Ultimately, that's not what the Don wanted for Michael. He wanted Michael to be legitimate, but that didn't happen. With that, we have a few questions we'd like answered. We like Don Corleone for his courteous, warm demeanor. He seems like a good guy, and tried to treat people fairly. He's a family man, who admittedly has a shady business. He has his own moral standards, but he's also a murderer, a thief, a thug. So how do we approach this? Is he a bad person? Or is he a good person who involved himself in some very bad choices? On the one hand, it's nice to be idealistic. No one should be a criminal. Everyone should play fair. But let's be realistic. It's not going to happen. Crime is perhaps endemic to society. So maybe there is something to say about honor among thieves. We prefer having criminals who observe a certain code. In some ways, Don Corleone tamed other criminals. Isn't that a good thing? Is there any value to this? Can we say, let's approve of Corleone's choices because he civilizes the criminals and keeps crime under tighter wraps, instead of allowing criminals to plague the street? Isn't that better, at least in some ways, than going in and completely destroying the community in which the criminals live? Or is that all just a front for their illegal activities? And lastly, all this said, it's nice to think Don Corleone is a courteous man, etc. He brings civility to the underworld. But he then says 2 very interesting things in his final speech to his son, Michael. 1. I have no regrets. That means he feels no remorse for the people he's killed, the corruption he's sown, all worth it as far as he's concerned to secure his own lot in life. And 2, he recognizes that this is not a legitimate life, and he wants something different for his son. Doesn't this show he knows what he's doing is wrong? It's all well and good to say he improved the underworld, but he did it for personal profit. It was his way of staying above the local crime lords and paving a better path for his children. This seems a bit perverse. Let's see how the Torah approaches these questions. I am excited to welcome Rabbi Chaim Willis to this episode to answer our questions. The son of a New York City police lieutenant, Rabbi Chaim Willis grew up in a liberal Jewish home. He received a BA in Chinese from the University of Michigan and then went on to pursue his interests in world affairs and journalism, traveling to India, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Iran, Syria, and Jordan. He would discover the culture of each country he visited, that is, until he ran out of money. He would then fly home to work as a cab driver until he had earned enough cash for the next adventure. Rabbi Willis eventually traveled to Israel and, while at the Western Wall, he was offered the opportunity to meet a truly wise man, Rabbi Noah Weinberg. Impacted by Rabbi Weinberg's deep Jewish wisdom, Rabbi Willis chose to explore Jewish ideas at Aish HaTorah in Jerusalem, delving into the original sources of both Jewish thought and practice. Rabbi Willis, back when he was known simply as Mike Willis, had a lengthy article written about him by his sister, Ellen Willis, which was published by Rolling Stone magazine called Next Year in Jerusalem. Rabbi Willis co-founded the first Aish HaTorah branch in the United States in St. Louis, Missouri. He is currently the executive director of Aish South Africa in Johannesburg and has recently moved back to Israel, splitting his time between Israel and South Africa. Willis, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to have you. And so we'll get right started. Godfather is an iconic movie. It's not even a classic, it's iconic. And I guess one of the kind of central dilemmas I think people have when they're confronting Don Corleone, is he a bad man who happens to do some good things or has some kind of moral code? Or is he like, look, he was drawn into this terrible world, but overall he's a moral guy. He's a good guy who just happens to do bad things to get his way, we'll say.
So I think the question that you need to ask, perhaps a deeper question, right? What does it mean someone's a good person or a bad person?
Okay, fair enough.
Is he a good person who's acting badly sometimes, or a bad person who's acting good sometimes? But what does that mean? So my teacher, Rabbi Noah Weinberg, he used to ask us, he would say, if you ask a good man or an evil man, are you a good man? Who is more likely to say he's good? And everybody, when they hear the question, they understand the evil man is more likely to say he's good, to think he's good. Because the reality is that no human being gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to do evil. Every human being thinks that in some way they're good.
Yeah, that's
let's say, who's a person that we all would agree was a very evil person? Hitler.
Yeah.
Hitler did not think he was an evil person. He thought he was fighting for humanity against those evil people, the Jews. And bad people always think they're doing good, and they have reasons why they think that. My father was a policeman in New York for 30 years, and he told me they never caught a criminal who didn't have an excuse. Even if you find someone for something like child molesting, the guy would say, well, I had a really rough upbringing, or the girl asked for it, or some crazy thing. But some way they had an excuse. So then the question is, if everybody thinks they're good, on what basis are we making a decision? Oh, this guy is good and that guy is evil. What defines good and evil?
That is a good question. So how would we approach that?
So I think to understand what it means good and evil, or in terms of, you'd have to start out with a deeper understanding of human beings. In the Talmud, it says that every human being, when a baby is in its mother's womb, an angel teaches it all wisdom. And it's not saying just Jews and non-Jews, everybody. A baby in its mother's womb, an angel teaches it all wisdom. Now, whether that's considered a metaphor or whether that's considered a fact, the rabbis wanted to tell you something deep about humanity. Now, to understand what that means, that an angel teaches you all wisdom, and then we say when you're born, you forget it. So what it means is that we all have ultimate wisdom about life, which includes intuition about what's good and what's not good. We're born with it, and we've forgotten it, and we have to re-understand it. That's what the rabbis are saying. And that would be the equivalent of, let's say, I gave you the greatest computer. I gave you a laptop that's programmed with every single fantastic program there is, but you don't know how to click on anything. So you don't know how to get into the computer.
Okay.
It's there, but you don't know how to get into it. So we understand that life is learning how to get into that computer through basically all the education we get. Starts from our parents educating us, starts from our schools educating us. A person who has a Torah education is way out in front in getting in touch with what's in that computer. And the Almighty set up a situation where the soul, even though the soul knows everything before it's put into the world, once it's in the world, it's not able to directly access what it knows without accessing that computer.
As in the soul will sounds like the soul will get confused unless it could access the mind, which helps direct it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That the soul has to access that knowledge that's in the mind.
Okay.
Right. And that's how we grow, and that's how we understand things, by accessing the knowledge that's in the mind. I'll give one example. In what I do, we teach students, and one of the things you'll teach them the law of Lashon Hara. Law of Lashon Hara, evil speech, is that it's wrong to say something bad about somebody, negative about somebody, even if what you say is true, even if he doesn't hear. Now, we'll teach that to somebody, a totally secular kid who doesn't know anything about Judaism. He'll immediately appreciate that that's true, that it really is a bad thing to do. Now, how does he appreciate that it's a bad thing to do? He's living in a world where that's what everybody's doing all the time. Yet when people hear it, I find that nobody gives you an objection. Say, well, wait a second, that's perfectly okay. What's the problem? Speaking badly about other people just for fun. What's wrong with that? Nobody says that. Everybody clicks into what the angel taught them, that's a bad thing to do.
It's interesting. I've actually heard it said, and it's interesting you used the word they forget. I heard it said that when you hear a true idea, it's not the experience of learning something new, it's the experience of recognizing it.
It's that you recognize. You recognize, yeah, I know that. So now there are certain ideas, like Lashon Hara, that people recognize right away, right? There are other ideas that are very hard for people to come in to recognize, because a human being is a soul, but he has a body, and the body has its desires and its things it wants and wants to do that are very often in contradiction to what the soul wants to do, right? And if you say those things, then there's a conflict.
I remember once I told someone that Judaism does not allow for revenge. Like, if you ask someone to borrow their shovel and they say no, and then they come the next time, they're like, hey, can I borrow your computer for a minute? And you're like, no, because you didn't let me borrow your shovel. I was like, you're not allowed to do that. And they got really upset. They're like, what? That's crazy. Like, why would I lend them something if they didn't agree to lend me? So yeah, I know exactly.
Yeah, because if the body has a reaction to it, then you don't immediately get in touch with your intuition, right?
Would you say it's a body problem or like more of a mind problem? It's not more of a kind of like intellectually that kind of makes us angry.
See, it's a body problem, but you have to understand how that works. You see that you have in your mind, again, your mind, the angel taught you all these things. You have it all in your mind. You need to get in touch with it. Once you're in touch with it, the soul can access it. But you pick up a lot of other things also. We would say there's almost like computer viruses that get stuck in your mind. I'll give you a strong example of how that process works. We used to have Gila Mandelson. She wrote books about the importance of not touching. Men and women shouldn't touch each other and get physically involved before they decide they're serious about each other, right? And she has a lot of strong reasons why that can be a very negative thing, and it can prevent people from seriously judging, do they want to get involved or not get involved, and that causes problems that affect marriages, et cetera, right? So we used to have her come and speak to our students, right? So I remember the one time we had her coming, and she's giving her, and she gives her class with different stories about how people mess themselves up by getting too involved too soon, too quickly, right? And she tells it, and it's a very reasonable class. And most of the girls in the class hear her, and they pick it up pretty quickly. They understand it's true, right? But there was one boy in the class. He storms out of the class, and he says, "This is the most illogical thing I have ever heard." Right? Now, I was listening to it. It wasn't illogical. You could disagree, but certainly not illogical. She has a lot of logic in what she presented. But what it is his desire. People, young men, find that a very difficult thing to accept. So what they'll do is they'll use their mind to try to come up with whatever arguments they can find from all the computer viruses they've learned that it's wrong. You know how prevents free. It's just consenting adults, and how can you prevent people from doing things that they want to do? And if you don't have experience, you're not going to be able to get married. You're not going to know who to get married to. They'll have different reasons, all coming from these computer viruses, right? So we would say that that's what we mean when we talk in Judaism about the Yetzer Hara, right? The evil inclination, meaning you have a body and you have a lawyer for the body that tries to use the mind to argue against what the soul would otherwise want to do.
Okay. So, or not do.
What?
What the soul would want to do, or what the soul
would want to do or not want to do.
Right.
Just to basically say, what does a lawyer do? A lawyer makes the best case for his client. A lawyer is not interested in truth. A lawyer makes the best case for his client. The body is the client. The Yetzer Hara is the lawyer. And since the soul is ultimately what's in charge of what your free will is and your decisions, the Yetzer Hara has to fool the soul by saying that what you might otherwise have thought is not right is really right, right?
Right. That's interesting. What I was thinking of when we were getting started, I actually went to law school, and I remember in constitutional law, one of the things we learned about was the difference between natural law and legal positivism. The difference is natural law is kind of what we were saying in terms of there's a natural, intuitive understanding of what is right and wrong. And that's what you base your laws on, as opposed to legal positivism, which is that which is correct is that which, like the legislature or whatever the lawmaking body of that country or city or state or whatever creates. So if it's passed into law, it's good. If it's made illegal, it's bad. And one of the it was interesting. Like even my constitutional law professor, he said one of the obvious glaring issues with legal positivism is, I mean, you mentioned Hitler, the Nazis. I don't think any correct thinking person could look at the laws on the Nazi books and be like, yeah, this is good because they passed it into law. It's like, no, there's like a universal human rights, which you would intuitively say, this is wrong. Now, again, you might have like room to disagree in terms of what's okay, what's not okay. You know, what's the proper age to drink? Is it 18? Is it 21? Okay, fine. Like, you know, you could argue about that, but there are certain things that you know intuitively are wrong. And to say legal positivism is
again, I would say that you have to understand that Hitler and the Nazis, they didn't think those laws were wrong. And this gets into what we want to talk about the nature of good and evil. Every evil person thinks he's good because his Yetzer Hara is creating arguments, is the lawyer for his body to say that something that we might think, if we don't have those desires, we might think are wrong. He's arguing that they're right.
So is that effect that we're saying about Don Corleone? Like
see with Don Corleone, so let's say you take a typical gangster, not Don Corleone. Don Corleone is the question is because he was sort of a gangster who had some good stuff also, right? But let's say you have a typical gangster who doesn't the guys who were doing drugs or the guys who were doing prostitution are the bad guys.
Right. The guy,
Right.
Because like Don Corleone didn't approve of hard drugs. He did not want to,
Right.
he held himself above
Right.
prostitution. Right. So he didn't get
Right.
involved in that. But the
Right.
other
But let's say
guys,
in the movie, let's say Salazzo, right? He's the guy that you were very happy when he got shot,
yeah.
right? Because he's
Right.
into drugs. He's
Right.
into bad stuff, right?
Right.
Now, if you went to him and said, "Wait a second, you're into drugs. It's you're an evil man," right? He would say, "No, look, I'm a businessman. I'm trying to make a living. People want this stuff. I supply them with what they want."
Right. And he'd probably also say, I think when either someone else is going to do it anyway. And if I remember correctly, I think he also was like, look, we're not going to go anywhere near schools. Like kids, oh my gosh, would
Yeah.
I do such a thing? Right.
Yeah,
Right.
So so he has his rationalizations, right?
Right.
Now, what makes him an evil man is basically just how, from an objective point of view, how, obviously crazy his rationalizations are. I mean, we could look at it and say, well, when you're a businessman and you're giving drugs to people and those drugs are killing people all over the place and you don't care.
Right.
So he's rationalizing that the fact that people want these things and that I need the money and whatever is a legitimate reason. I'm just a businessman providing a service like any other businessman is providing a service. So what makes him an evil man is that it's the extent of his rationalization. A reasonable person would say, well, wait a second, you're ignoring so many bad aspects in what you're doing.
All the negative features of drugs, you're just sweeping them away
Right.
because, hey, people want it, so I'll supply. As if you're just like a nice guy who's supplying like cleaning products to clean your house.
Right.
So there's Salazzo. So how would we say that about in terms of Don Corleone doesn't want to get involved in that because
So Don Corleone would be, on the one hand, he's making his rationalizations, right?
Right.
He makes his rationalization. I mean, by any reasonable standard, it's not basically that good for society to have gangs, and he's involved in sort of, let's say, loan sharking, right? You give loans to people and then they can't pay it back, and then you enforce them and you beat them up or you kill them, right? As a gangster, he would have to do that. So he'll be involved in that, but he won't be involved in drugs. So he has his rationalizations are better than Salazzo's, right? Because drugs is a greater step. You're having to avoid the fact that you're killing lots and lots of people by promoting drugs.
I think one of the more interesting element of Don Corleone is we kind of almost, in some way, we almost relate. We kind of almost like Don Corleone because these two rapist guys like somehow got away. They escaped the justice system. So Don Corleone, who comes in and effectively enforces justice, we're like, hey, we kind of wish the justice system would do that. Or a person like, in a way, he provides loans to people who otherwise couldn't get them. Now, true, there's the whole dark underpinnings of the whole loan shark business where the guy can apparently never pay it back. But what would you say in terms of their rationalizations? But one of those rationalizations is sometimes people escape the justice system. Sometimes the system doesn't work for other people. That's like almost exactly what Don Corleone says to this. I think that the Undertaker, when he comes to ask for justice for his daughter, he's like, look, the system worked for you great, and now it doesn't, and now you need someone like me to step in. So you could say so he's like kind of supplies a need. So I have another question about the underworld, but let's start with that.
Yeah. So you would say there's some good things that he does, right? But you'd also say that that's not his central purpose in doing what he's doing is not to be a dispenser of justice.
Right. That's true.
That's a side. It's a side thing he might do, and the central purpose of his loan sharking is not because he wants to provide money to people who need money.
Right. He's
central purpose of what he's doing. Central purpose of what he's doing is because he wants to make money for himself and get power for himself. The fact that there are certain levels of bad that he won't do makes him in some way a better person than Salazzo is, let's say. because he has limitations. But you wouldn't say his motivations. His motivations are basically, I'm trying to do things for myself
In fact,
maybe my family. And in order to do those things, I'm willing to do certain things that we would say are not very good, like killing the guy who doesn't pay back the loan.
and tuning into the whole family thing, like that does seem to be a central rationalization. He says to Michael, I never wanted this for you. I worked my whole life. I don't apologize, which is interesting. I don't apologize to take care of my family. And I refuse to be a fool dancing on the string held by all those big shots. I don't apologize. That's my life. And then he says, but I thought that, actually, in fact, sorry, just to finish that quote, but I thought that when it was your time, that you would be the one to hold the string. Senator Corleone, Governor Corleone, well, it wasn't enough time, Michael, it wasn't enough time, which is a really interesting quote because it really seems like he kind of understands that what he's doing isn't great. It's like, I actually want to talk about that. So in terms of, on the one hand, we can relate to wanting to take care of your family is real. So what do you say? If you were to say, like, hey, you shouldn't do that. And he's like, I'm just trying to take care of my family. Now he goes about it in a underhanded, illegal, criminal, violent way. But what would you say to that? I mean, like, that's a real, I think most people would be like, yeah, he's taking care of his family. Right? You might be like, I wish I could take care of my family.
You would say, let's say, okay, you have a family, right? You want to take care of them. Okay, so then rob a bank and take money to help your family. You would say, no, there's certain limitations, even in taking care of my family. If I need to take care of my family by holding down a job and making money to support my family, whatever. But I can't necessarily rob a bank for it. I can't necessarily beat up someone for it. There's limitations in what you can do. So he went over those limitations in that sense, and he used rationalizations that we might not appreciate, like everything goes to take care of your family, or that, which we wouldn't accept.
Right.
So the fact that there's levels of rationalizations that he doesn't go to, that's what makes him a better person than Salazar.
And leaning in on the reality of the situation. So perhaps you could say, and I think this is kind of where things get more ambiguous. You could have Don Corleone or someone like him say, if we're dealing with reality, we know that there's crime, there are going to be criminals. It's a feature of human life. Like, there are criminals in every society. Now, Don Corleone does a lot to kind of, they call it the pacification of New York. He really kind of calms people down. There's much less street crime, right? People are less fearful of their lives on a regular basis. You could just imagine that, when gangs are roaming around the streets, it's not conducive to building community or kids growing up in a safe environment or families constantly feeling for their lives. So you can see, like, look, Don Corleone really calmed things down. He didn't get involved in prostitution. He wanted to avoid hard drugs. He reined people in. He would either absorb or eliminate other gangs who weren't kind of towing the line. And just, he was like, I don't know if you'd use this language, but he's like, everyone needs to relax. Let's kind of operate this as a more like industrious business and resort to those kinds of, illegal activities, the violent activities, to keep that to a minimum. Perhaps you could say, like, listen, this is not an ideal world we're dealing with, right? And like, first, just generally, the whole world is not in its ideal state. And certainly the criminal world is obviously not ideal. So why can't we say, like, Don Corleone is a good man in a bad world? He mitigates a lot of crime by putting into place these certain institutions. He doesn't want to get involved in certain businesses. And through his example, other crime families are like, you know what? This actually works. So let's tone down the unsavory things that we do in order to make this a better operation. I mean, I would think that's almost like the best. You could say, I want to support my family. Okay, you can't go around killing people because you want to support your family. That we can understand. But in a broader societal perspective, you could say, hey, like, look, he's doing a lot to kind of, rein in a lot of these evil people.
But at the same time, that's not his motivation. He didn't go into being a gangster because he wanted to improve society. Once he's doing it, it would be an example. Let's say someone is, a guy takes a gun and he goes and robs a bank, right? But when he's doing it, instead of hurting the people in the bank or whatever, or he's very friendly to them. He's nice to them. He says, "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. Just sit down. It'll be okay." He makes a few jokes. It would certainly be better if I'm going to be in a bank that gets held up. I'd rather be held up by a guy who's joking around and tells me for sure he's not going to do anything to me, etc. But that doesn't justify robbing the bank. He didn't rob the bank because he wanted to be nice to these people.
Perhaps my example would be, imagine you have a gang of bank robbers who are going to go rob a bank, and they're like, "We're going to kill anybody who resists." And you have this other bank robber who's like, "You need to relax and not do that. Let's instead crack jokes, treat people in a respectful." There was a movie Inside Man. Oh, hopefully I'm not. Spoiler alert. There's a movie Inside Man in Denzel Washington where they go in, they steal from a guy who assisted the Nazis, and that's how he kind of built his whole fortune. And he tried to bury it under good deeds afterwards. And then, so they go in and rob the bank. Now, it turns out that their guns were all fake guns. They pretended to kill somebody, but they didn't actually kill anyone. No one really got hurt. It was all an act, and that's how they robbed the bank. So imagine you were going to have real bank robbers who are going to go in and potentially kill people. And you had one guy be like, "Guys, it's not necessary. Let's not kill anybody. Don't hurt anybody. Let's just be really clever about it, and let's commit our crime in that way." Now, again, let's say forget the whole Nazi cooperative. Let's say they actually rob a legitimate bank. So I think that's a fair point to say, that bank robber who really mitigated the amount of damage, don't rob the bank. But hey, we want more criminals like that, who are, if they're going to go around doing things, aren't going to do such horrible things. I think that's a proper analogy.
Better to have a happy criminal than an unhappy criminal. Better. That doesn't excuse. It doesn't mean that the happy criminal becomes a righteous person by being a happy criminal. He's better. Why? Because you're judged more on your central goals. If you're Don Corleone, you're a gangster because you want to make money for yourself. Okay, you care about your family, so you want to make money for your family. And in order to do that, you'll do some not very good things, right? But the not very good thing, you also have certain limitations that you won't do what certain other people will do. But it doesn't make you a good person, because your basic goal is still, I'm trying to make money for myself, get power for myself, and I'm willing to violate certain moral rules to do it. There are other people who are willing to do worse, okay? But I'm willing to violate certain things. That doesn't make me a good person. See, human beings are complicated. Everybody has good things. Let's say, someone like Meyer Lansky, who was the guy who set up Las Vegas and was responsible for a lot of things, right? He also was a big supporter of Israel in 1948 when Israel was fighting for its life. There were Jewish gangsters who helped out Israel. So those were good things. Those good things don't necessarily make the person a good person. Sometimes the good things a person can do can be so good that they overcome the negatives. But that's just the nature of human beings. Human beings have a good side and a bad side.
Okay, this was great. I think that wrapped up my questions. Rabbi Willis, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish Perspective podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for a moral dilemma you'd like analyzed, feel free to send it over. Thanks again, and see you next time.